Hurricane Sandy has devastated the East Coast. Is the superstorm proof that we need more big government? I'm Alan Barton. Stand by for Front Page. Joining me on set to discuss today, Terry Jones, Associate Editor of Investors Business Daily, and Rita Parnabasu, Writer and Research Associate with the Ayn Rand Center for Individual Rights. So we've heard the term never let a good crisis go to waste. Well, the New York Times has used the occasion of Hurricane Sandy to prove that we need more big government, that government is the only entity qualified and able to deal with a crisis of this magnitude. Terry, what do you think?
Well, you know, for certain people among the media elites and in the left-wing reaches of government, the answer is always big government. And whatever the question is, the answer is more big government.
A hurricane czar.
We need a hurricane czar.
A hurricane czar.
Maybe this wouldn't have happened if we had a hurricane czar.
If there was a hurricane czar, this, you know, it wouldn't have developed.
Yeah, it's an absurd and almost infantile reaction. It's kind of like, you know, I don't know, primitive peoples in Papua New Guinea praying to airplane gods and things because they saw them during World War II. Yeah. Some people on the left seem to think that big government somehow inoculates you against any tragedy, and that big government, as inefficient as it is, can somehow solve all your problems. It just can't.
Read to the New York Times liberals. I mean, this is largely based on the FEMA issue, the Federal Emergency Management Association, or whatever it is, and Romney's comments on FEMA during the campaign. Why don't we take a look at what he said?
FEMA's about to run out of money, and there are some people who say do it on a case-by-case basis, and some people who say, you know, maybe we're learning a lesson here that the states should take on more of this role. How do you deal with something like that?
Absolutely. Every time you have an occasion to take something from the federal government and send it back to the states, that's the right direction. And if you can go even further and send it back to the private sector, that's even better.
Ritu, what are your thoughts there on the government's comments on the overall issue of FEMA, which is looked upon as this great beneficial force when dealing with these crises?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to note why everyone is so interested now in Romney's comments. So they're trying to figure out, well, is he for big government or is he against big government? Well, the Romney plan wants to spend 20% of the GDP by the federal government. Obama wants to spend 22%. We're not really having, this is not a big government issue. Yet this is what the New York Times portrays it as. This is the issue of big government. Now FEMA, last year, 0.2% of what the federal government was spent on FEMA. So this is not what the debate over big government is about whether the government should take certain action when a storm of the century hits. It's about things like, well, should the government be paying for healthcare? Should we be paying for education? Should we be paying for retirement? These are the issues that really is what big government is about. So I think there's a real question of what is the New York Times' motivation in bringing up this issue now, particularly when you have all these victims, and they're using those victims to make a political point. That's very sinister.
And Terry, you know, Obama's own budget, I think, next year cuts a good chunk of $1 billion out of FEMA,
yeah.
$641 million, I think, out of the budget. But it is interesting, you know, when you look at the crisis response, what is the first thing that these governors and the president do in response to these crises? They remove government obstacles to getting things done. So there's this sort of hypocrisy where it's like, we need big government, we need big government. First time something hits, the first thing they do is, like, we got to get rid of the red tape. Got to get rid of the red tape and the regulations and the things and the qualifications so we can get help to the people directly. And it's just, no one seems to see the irony of that situation.
No, and the thing is, you know, the first responders in emergencies like this always has to be the local city or state or county. It cannot be the federal government. The federal government is not quick enough. It's too much a Leviathan, and as we saw in Katrina, and as we're seeing right now in the case of Hurricane Sandy. Anybody who thinks that the federal government response, other than photo ops by Obama, has been massive or in any way helpful, just talk to the people on Staten Island. They're all pretty damned upset. They think they've been ignored. So, you know, it's really local areas that have to respond to this, and mayors have to be ready for this kind of thing, and they very rarely are.
And isn't it the classic situation where, because there's this idea that the federal government is going to come in and save you and solve all this situation, it takes the local government's off the hook for doing the proper preparations for this. There's that issue as well. And the issue of, look, no one wants people to have the hardships that they're having over there, but 100 years ago, people didn't build houses 10 feet from the ocean, and that was for a reason. Because there are going to be floods, no matter what you do. Whether you want to say it's global warming or not global warming, I mean, there have been great floods, and there have been gigantic hurricanes that hit New York before, the era of global warming. So what about the issue of personal responsibility and local responsibility for your lives?
There definitely is a phenomenon where the government is trying to stop you from taking, or trying to protect you from the consequences of taking certain risks. So if you're going and you're building a house in New Orleans, there's a certain risk there. Now, if you know the government is going to go rebuild your house for you, possibly for free, that changes your decision making, right? And so you have people, these sorts of coastal towns like New Orleans, for example, it's been flooded before. It gets rebuilt by the government. Now, should the government be doing that? Of course, that's going to make a difference into what people decide, and that's definitely an issue.
What do you think the government should be doing in something like this? Does the federal government have a role? I mean, if you look back at Katrina, first of all, remember they said like we were going to have a Katrina every year? The global warming people were like, every year the Katrina, this is it. We're going to see this all the time. 7 years later, we finally get a really big hit on the coast. But what should the government be doing? I remember the Superdome episode. Like we're all, there you go. Like, okay, let's get some military in there who can go in there and clear these people out in helicopters. You go, that's probably something that the federal government could do, National Guard. That's something that they should do. What do you think is the dividing line between what localities should be responsible for and what the feds really can do?
Well, that's a good question. And, I think one thing that the, federal authorities are responsible for is they're responsible for security. I mean, the security of our country. And if a part of the country is sort of dissolving into chaos and random acts of violence, they need to have people there. To the extent that they have built infrastructure, they are responsible for the infrastructure, or have financed infrastructure or co-built it. Here in Los Angeles, for instance, we have a massive port complex, part of which has been built and sanctioned by the federal government. If something happens to that, I'm assuming they will have some role in building it back up. But that said, once again, it does sort of infantilize the local response because, if you think back to 2005 and Ray Nagin's non-response in New Orleans.
Where are the keys?
Mike Bloomberg's commandeering this time around of generators for the marathon. Badly needed generators that could go someplace else.
And he's got a whole division of the NYPD still looking out for 16-ounce sodas.
Yeah.
In case someone tries to sneak a 16-ounce soda under desperate circumstances, that will not be happening in New York. And one thing, Reed, I'll give you 15 seconds. There was an era before FEMA. There was an era before giant big government, and disasters still happened. I mean, there's the Chicago fires, there's the San Francisco quake, there's all sorts of terrible things that have happened. We seem to all get through it. We got through it, not just fine. These were horrible things that you had to get through, but we did it. And we did it without. What is so much better about having this agency?
Well, yeah, I think people forget. People are so benevolent in America. I mean, when a tragedy like this strikes, people are so willing to help out. I mean, less than 48 hours after this happened, Bon Jovi and Bruce Springsteen already had their concert lined up. I mean, how much money is that going to raise? And I mean, private solutions are possible. And before the whole safety net system in America that's really, now it's protecting everyone apparently, people were able to get together and help each other in times of need, and this wasn't really an issue. And so you have to kind of see, why do we need government here when the private market, when people are voluntarily so willing to help and form associations like that?
All right, guys, that's all the time we have for that. For Rito and Terry, I'm Alan Barton, and you've been watching Front Page.